the CoCo Crew Podcast is hosted by CyberEars. If you are serious about your podcast hosting needs, you should check out CyberEars. Whether you are a podcaster, a radio host, a musician, a narrator, an audiobook author, or simply a school, church, corporation, or anyone else with an audio recording that needs to be hosted or distributed, you should check out cyberears.com. Unlimited bandwidth, fast, reliable, and rugged servers with no hidden fees. CyberEars, your audio, your terms.
Listen, it's getting closer.
Hey, you got your CoCo 3 yet? Hey, you got your CoCo 3 yet?
You're listening to the CoCo Crew Podcast, a delicious adventure into the world of retro computing news and information featuring the Tandy Color Computer. All right, welcome back to episode 4 of the CoCo Crew Podcast. This is John Linville.
And Neil Blanchard.
And we are the CoCo Crew. Since our last recording, you may have had a chance to listen to us as we appeared with Randy Kindig on Floppy Days. That was episode 46, I believe, of Floppy Days. Randy's got a good podcast out there, covers a lot of retro computing platforms. If you're not familiar with Floppy Days, then I would suggest that you hit pause now and go check it out. Don't worry, we'll wait. All right, now that you're back from checking out Floppy Days, we've got a show lined up for you tonight, or today, or whenever you're listening to this podcast. We're going to, I'm going to continue my breakdown of the CoCo from a technical perspective. This time talking about the peripheral interface adapters, or PIAs, and what all they're used for on the CoCo. And then Neil is going to do another game review. Neil, what are you going to be talking about this time?
I'm going to be talking about the DICOM light phaser adapter, and that runs 2 games for the CoCo, Iron Forest and Medieval Madness. Awesome.
And those are fun little games. The light gun is a cool technology. Unfortunately, you do have to have the tube televisions to make them work. But hopefully having access to a tube television or a tube monitor is not a hardship for most of our listeners. Anyway, I think the technical segment at least is going to run a little shorter than usual. Maybe Neil's game segment will run a little longer than usual. I'm hoping that we'll have a little bit of an expanded set of discussions between me and Neil this time. And hopefully you'll enjoy whatever we talk about. Anyway, so I hope it's going to be a great show. So let's move on with the announcements. Okay, so we are the CoCo Crew Podcast. We are available on Twitter as at CoCo Crew Podcast. So please follow us, and we'll try to get a little information out about new shows and then occasionally some extra items of interest throughout the month. We are also on Facebook. We have a group called, again, the CoCo Crew Podcast. Not too hard to find. If you're listening to us, I guess you've already found our podcast audio files, but just in case, we are available through iTunes, and we are streamed on Stitcher. I noticed, we are above 300 downloads for episode 3, and I noticed checking Stitcher yesterday, we actually had 3 listeners on Stitcher this time around. So our Stitcher audience is growing. We've tripled in size, so very, very exciting news there.
You know, that's good to hear. I still have to learn what Stitcher even is.
Exactly. All this newfangled technology. So, again, if you want to reach the show via email, we're available as show@cococrew.org. podcast at cococrew.org or feedback at cococrew.org. Those will all reach both Neil and me. And if you need to reach us individually, as some of you seem to prefer, I'm available as John at cococrew.org, and Neil is available, of course, as Neil at cococrew.org. And as you probably heard at the beginning of the show, we are now hosted by Cyber Ears. They've been kind enough to provide us hosting for our audio files, and we are happy to accept their generosity. That's our announcements. You ready to move on to news?
I am.
Okay. Well, the first news items that I have listed is my very alliterative Canadian CoCo collection captured by our own Neil Blanchard. Neil, do you want to say something about that?
I sure do. First of all, I have to say September was a great month for retro goodness. Going to VCF at the end of August. I mean, that was an excellent trip. And then I was fortunate to score a huge CoCo collection in Toronto, and it was quite a keeper. Basically, what happened, I woke up Sunday morning, checking the Facebook thread, half asleep, my eyes barely open, and I see a posting from a guy in Quebec saying this would be a heck of a deal for someone who lives close to Toronto. So I'm thinking, well, I live pretty close to Toronto. So I checked it out. It was a link on Kijiji, which is basically like Craigslist, but, here in Canada, that's what we use. And so I look at it. It was a huge CoCo lot listed for $100 of best offer. And the stuff in the lot was just, was just amazing. There was the DICOM adapter, which I'm going to review. And so I messaged the guy, and I even called him, left a voicemail. Never heard back, so I figured, it's been posted for a few hours. I lost it. Sure enough, he calls me. I'm in the car, and I pick up the call, and he said, well, I'm second in line. There's another guy coming. So I said, okay, well, no problem. I don't want to jump the deal if someone else is coming at night. But I said, I'm willing to offer you, more money. And then I said, a lot more. And then he paused and said, well, I have to ask, how much he offered me. And I said, 500, just like that.
Oh, wow. And that's Canadian money.
That's Canadian. So
Sorry, had to get that in.
Yeah. So he paused, and then he said, well, you're now first in line. So I went down, took me about 2 hours to get there in a pouring rain, and it was a big CoCo lot. And one of the best lines when I was there picking up the lot, he said he hadn't touched the CoCo in about 15 years. And just when he decided to list it all, he actually said, do you believe there's people making new hardware for this machine? And I just started laughing. He said, there's a flash cart for this machine, Cloud9. There's a company called Cloud9 on the web. It was just funny. I was speechless.
You tell him you know those guys?
Oh, I did. Yeah, he was shocked. I said, well, there's an event you can go to called CoCo Fest. It's every year. And he was just shocked. Like, he had no idea. It was just great. Awesome. The look on his face was,
Well, let's I wonder how many other old CoCo folks are out there unaware of these things. Maybe we can catch a few of them before they are ready to ditch their CoCo wares. Although it's okay with me if a few of them do get rid of their things, because I don't have everything I want yet either.
Well, the good news, he actually did keep one thing. He kept his CoCo 1, and so I did mention the podcast. I gave him the links for the podcast to check us out. And, I just kind of told him about the community a little bit and the mailing list. So you never know. He might jump on.
Awesome. Well, if that's the case, welcome aboard. And we hope that you do some great things and we can report about that. Anyway, well, that's cool. That's a cool story, Neil. I think all of us that are kind of cross the line into being collectors dream about that sort of situation. Some of us have had that sort of situation from time to time, and sometimes there's a little buyer's remorse once you've got the whole pile stacked up in your garage or whatever. But I imagine if you've got too much stuff hanging around, I imagine there's some of us who can help you out with that.
Yeah, I think there's always a buyer. Now, I think 500 Canadian. What's that? That's pretty much free in the States, right?
Yeah, it's what, $25. Oh Lord, not quite, but
yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, that's a cool story. congratulations on the big win there, and I imagine we'll probably see some of that filter out through eBay or other sources. So very exciting for all of us. Okay, so moving on. Next item I have is the headline was Expander CoCo Lives from Jim Brain. The Expander CoCo is Jim's design for a replacement or alternative to the multi-pack interface. So he's working on a new design. Speaking of new hardware for the CoCo, he's working on a new design for a cartridge expansion for the CoCo. I think it's basically supposed to be software compatible with the multi-pack. He posted about where he had been, I guess, at VCF Midwest. I don't know if you saw Jim there.
Yes, I did. I also had the pleasure to test that device.
Oh, yeah, and that's what I was going to say. It sounded like at least some of it worked, but maybe it wasn't doing too well with the Super IDE just yet.
That was about the only thing. It worked with everything else. So it's definitely getting there.
So hopefully, so apparently there's some sort of discrepancy or oddness or whatever between Jim's design and whatever the Super IDE is doing to access the CoCo bus. I know he's been in contact with Mark Marlette there. I'm not sure they've made any real progress on resolving it, but hopefully that'll be resolved soon. And I know the multi-pack, sometimes much maligned in the CoCo's history, is sort of an ugly wart on the side of the CoCo, but also a quite necessary thing for a fully expanded CoCo system. It's been something that a lot of collectors have been seeking recently, and there's been enough demand to make them seem at least a bit rare. So it'll be good to have a source for some new ones so that everybody who wants or needs some sort of multi-pack expansion can get one. So, Jim, good luck on completing that design, and we certainly will report on it when it's done. All right, our next item, we mentioned, I think in episode 3, that there was some effort to get the source code for the VCC CoCo 3 emulator released. Bill Pierce was leading the effort, I think, and he was kind of going to do something a little unorthodox and basically assert that it was intended to be released, and then he was going to release it. And I guess this got the attention of the actual author, who had sort of fallen off the map a little bit, and that's Joseph. I don't know how to pronounce this. Is it Forgione or Forgione? Forgione? I don't know. It's Forgeone. I'm going to say Forgione. If that's not correct, again, please feel free to contact us and correct me. Anyway, Joseph showed up and followed through on getting the release out. So the code is now released under version 3 of the GPL, the GNU public license. So I'm happy to, as I said before, I'm happy to see the source code for that released, and I'm even more happy to see it released in a very safe sort of way with the actual author involved. I don't know how much has happened with that since then. I think there are some people working with the code, and some people may have been able to get it compiling in Visual Studio or whatever. Again, it is the sources as it stands is for Windows only. I'm hoping there'll be some effort to get it ported to SDL or some other cross-platform library to make it available to a broader audience, including Mac and Linux, maybe the mobile platforms. Anyway, so good news. If VCC is your favorite emulator, it may at least now get some updates and maybe get a wider range of support. Okay, so the next item relates to the CoCo 3 FPGA. I know we've also mentioned that on the podcast before. This is a project to implement a hardware version of the CoCo 3 implemented in a modern FPGA, or at least somewhat modern. I don't know how modern it is now. That's the board that they're targeting, the DE1, has been out for a while. There's been some work there. I know Nick Marentis came onto the CoCo 3 FPGA group and was testing some of his existing programs and finding stuff that didn't run and reporting it to Gary. And Gary Becker, who's the author of the CoCo 3 FPGA source. Gary took some of that information and made some fixes that got at least some of Nick's games working. He's been doing some work there, and he has taken the step to actually release. I'm not sure. I think when he said he was releasing it, he said it was most of the source or partial source. I'm not exactly sure what wording he was using. So it may not be quite all the source for the CoCo 3 FPGA, but there's a lot more of it available now than there used to be. So if you are I think it's written in VHDL. It's either VHDL or Verilog. Either way, if you're a hacker on that sort of stuff, there's more for you to hack on now. So if you're interested in having a CoCo 3 implemented in the FPGA with some potential extensions, have at it and go and grab it and do some good with it. Someone else has been mentioned on the podcast before, Barry Nelson. He has a project site at Hackaday where he has listed a circuit for adding composite video output on a CoCo 1. So the CoCo 1 does produce composite video on the board, but the signal that comes out is generally not strong enough for, at least not for everyone's monitor. I have heard of people being able to use it in some cases, but your mileage may vary. Anyway, he's taken this project site and put out a better circuit for doing that. So basically, it's a little transistor amplifier, and he shows you where to tap for the transistors, and he actually has another side circuit for getting the audio output, so you can get the two RCA jacks on the back of your CoCo for outputting video and audio for driving a composite monitor or television.
This is great to see because now all the CoCos, the whole line will have composite out.
Yeah, so it's good to have the RF output from the CoCo, especially the aging CoCos. It seems to slip a bit with age. Maybe it wasn't all that good to begin with. And TVs that can accept it is a little bit harder to find. I think it's not quite as hard as people think it is, but because of the way wires and such have changed over the years, people don't necessarily realize that they can still plug in to some of their TVs. And nowadays there are more monitors or whatever that come out that just don't even have a NTSC receivers. So it's a good option to have. Your existing monitors probably will die eventually. It's just sort of a matter of time. So good to be prepared. Moving on. Seems like our news segments this time is more about new projects than about, or is more about updates to existing projects than it is about new projects. But that's okay. Updates to existing projects means they're still alive and healthy, right? So another project we've been covering on the podcast is the CMOC compiler from Pierre Sarrazin, one of Neil's countrymen, if I'm not mistaken. So Pierre posted that he has, in his latest rounds of updates to CMOC, he now has what he calls embryonic support for OS 9. So it sounds like maybe it's kind of limited, but it is at least possible to write CMOC code, which is essentially C code with maybe some set of limitations that I can't quite enumerate. But anyway, it's basically a C compiler or something close to a C compiler. And now, along with targeting RS-DOS, you can do some amount of targeting OS 9. So that's pretty exciting. And again, we're excited to hear that there's efforts continuing by Pierre to improve his project, and hope to continue to see more exciting updates in the future. So another project that we've discussed a bit is from Brett Gordon. He's made some more progress on what I've been calling Fusix, and I heard someone refer to as Fuzzix, and recently in Brett, he had a video, and he's actually seemed to be pronouncing it Fuzix. So there's at least 3 ways to pronounce this. Fuzix or Fuzix, Fuzzix. Anyway, it is a project that comes from, like I say, a Linux hacker person that I know personally called Alan Cox, based on some earlier projects on a Unix-like kernel for the Z80 called Uzi, or maybe you can also pronounce that different ways. But anyway, he's expanded it out, and he's targeted, along with Z80, some of the Z80-based retro stuff like the MSX. He's also got it compiling for 6502, and for thanks to some CoCo folks and Dragon folks on the 6809. And Brett has expanded the 6809 port out to the CoCo 3, and he's showing where he's able to boot up and not just boot the kernel, but also load and run a user space, including a Unix-like shell, and do some simple stuff. I think he even has Hunt the Wumpus ported over there. So that is a really cool project. One of maybe the project I'm most jealous of on the list, just because I'm kind of a Unix guy myself. Anyway, if you're interested in having another operating system platform to hack on for the CoCo, and if you're at all interested in, excuse me, in Unix-like kernels, then you may want to check out what Brett is up to, and I think you'll agree it's pretty exciting stuff. All right, so moving beyond, we've got a trio of Dragon-related projects that I would like to talk about. These all have links out to the World of Dragon forum site. The first one is the DOS Plus extender for DriveWire and CoCo SDC. And so basically what this is taking a Dragon DOS or some version of Dragon DOS, kind of like RS DOS, had a lot of variants and modified versions. I think the Dragon also, their Dragon DOS had some set of modifications. So I don't know if this is starting from a stock Dragon DOS or starting from one of those extensions, but I think it's the person's first name is Per, P-E-R-E. Is it, or Perry? I'm not sure how to pronounce that either. But Per, I think. I don't know Per's last name. But anyway, Per has done some hacking and now has a version of Dragon DOS that runs on the CoCo SDC. Again, CoCo SDC is a project we've talked about. Hardware was designed by Darren Atkinson, and it is essentially a floppy drive emulator that writes floppy drive images out to a SD card, and it's been available for the CoCo for a while with SDC DOS, which has the extensions related to that hardware, but otherwise provides essentially an RS-DOS experience. And so I guess Pear now has the Dragon version of that. And so Dragon users around the world shall rejoice and now know the beauty of the CoCo SDC. So pretty exciting stuff there.
It's nice to see the Dragon get a lot of love lately. You know, it's going to be an excuse for me to get mine out.
Yeah. The Dragon is a great little machine. It's it's pretty similar to a CoCo 1 or CoCo 2. The hardware itself seems pretty solid. I've got a Tano Dragon, which of course is the NTSC version. I've also got a Dragon 32 that I got from someone in Spain. It's puts PAL. Anyway, it's cool. It's you get that same nuclear green screen or whatever, and you can run a lot of the same programs can at least partially run, or depends on how much exact access they need to the specific hardware of the Dragon, or if they need to access the keyboard or not. But for example, Farfall will run on a Dragon. Anyway, like I said, it's a cool project, or it's a cool platform. And if you're a CoCo person, you definitely should check it out. You might find something interesting there. Still in the Dragon world, there is another project that's actually been around for a while. There's a multi-cartridge that has had a revision. It was at revision 1.5. Now there's a revision 1.6 available. this multi-cartridge. It's technologically it's maybe not that advanced. It's basically just a large EEPROM with some switches on it, and you program the EEPROM with a bunch of ROM images, and the switches actually manipulate the upper address lines of the EEPROM so that you access the image that you're interested in. He's added a 2-digit 7-segment display so that you can get some indication of which image is active. And then I guess in this case, in the 1.6 version of his design, he's changed. This is from someone called Rollo. Again, I don't know Rollo's last name either. But Rollo has redesigned his circuit board in a form factor that will now fit inside an Atari cartridge shell. So it probably doesn't quite fill up the slot bay on the Dragon or the CoCo, but at least it's wrapped some plastic around the circuit so to keep your fingers off of it. Anyway, it looks like a nice little project. I've heard some good things about the earlier versions, at least. I have not bought one for no particular reason. I just haven't. It looks like a cool project. Maybe I should correct that error.
Yeah, I think I'm going to pick one up too. Sounds great.
Yeah. So, okay. So their third item in the Dragon world is from someone called Zaxxon, Z-A-X-O-N. I have no idea what Zaxxon's first or last name is, unless he just happens to be called Zaxxon. I guess that's possible. Anyway, so Zaxxon has produced a set of floppy drive controllers, or a floppy drive controller for the Dragon. In case you don't realize, there actually is a slight hardware difference between the floppy drive controller of the CoCo and the floppy drive controller on the Dragon, and it has to do. I'd have to look up the specifics, but it has to do with the way the synchronization is done for reading data off of the floppy as the disk is spinning or whatever, right? And so the CoCo, I think, uses a halt line, and I think the Dragon may use an interrupt line. I'm not sure exactly. I guess that'd be the cart line, so not really NMI. Anyway, one way or another, the hardware is a little bit different, so you can't exactly take a CoCo floppy drive controller and plug it into a Dragon. Obviously, the software itself has to change to Dragon DOS. And then I think there is a version of Dragon DOS out there that someone hacked to work with the CoCo style of hardware. So if you find the right ROMs, you actually can plug a Tandy floppy controller into your Dragon. But in this case, you can get a new floppy controller for your Dragon and not use a hacked ROM. You can use an original Dragon DOS ROM and hook up floppy drives to your Dragon. Whether or not you want to do that maybe is a different question. Some people don't like their floppy drives. I know Neil and I were discussing this earlier, that sometimes having the floppy drives connected, even if they are antiquated and quaint, it's still a more nostalgic, at least, experience. It's sort of a more real experience for your retro computing pleasures. What do you think, Neil?
Oh yeah, I'm definitely in. I kind of have a floppy drive addiction myself, so I can't disagree with that.
Yeah, so it is kind of cool sometimes to have a floppy drive. I know
creates the full experience from how it was originally.
It definitely does. There probably are some CoCo folks that have, for whatever reason, have trouble finding a floppy controller. Some of those may want one. The CoCo SDC maybe doesn't solve every problem. Certainly, if you've got a floppy disk laying around, the CoCo SDC won't read that. It is still possible, or at least until fairly recently, and maybe I think probably is still possible to buy brand new Tano Dragons from a site on the internet, but you can't get any floppy controllers from them. So if you happen to have picked up one of those new Dragons, and you need a floppy controller, and you haven't found the Dragon DOS ROM that works with the Tandy floppy controller, this is a great option. That's pretty exciting. So anyway, it's cool. Like, as you say, as your friend that you made over the weekend, spying his collection, pointed out, there are people making new stuff for the CoCo. and in this case, making new stuff for the Dragon. Very exciting stuff. So, well, I guess what we need to do is some people need to pick up these Dragon floppy controllers and then hack a RS-DOS ROM to work with the Dragon hardware, the way somebody hacked Dragon DOS to work with Tandy hardware. Yeah, and then the circle will be complete, right?
That's right.
All right. Moving on, one more news item. Again, I think I mentioned Mocha before, and that Brad Greer. I don't think I heard from Brad on the pronunciation. I'm going to say Greer. Did I say Greer before? Brad was continuing to work on JavaScript. He said last time JavaScript is not dead. And in this case, Mocha is not dead, is what he said last time. And I mentioned that he was working on a JavaScript version. Well, he seems to have completed that, and it comes up in the browser, and you can select cassette images or cartridge images or disk images. You can select different versions of the video output. You can select whether it's extended basic or just color basic or disk basic. Lots of cool stuff. So if you have no other emulation source, or if you just prefer emulation in the browser, it's a good option. You may want to give that a try. That link will be in the show notes.
Or even if you're bored at work and you got a little bit of time to kill.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. That's probably a great option there. If you just kind of your emergency, let's bring up the emulator because I'm stuck here with a browser kind of situation. It's a great one for that.
Get a quick CoCo fix.
Yeah, exactly. All right. One more news item. It's a little bit silly, but we've mentioned the CoCo Fest many times, and generally when we mention CoCo Fest, we mention that the guys that are still producing CoCo Fest, there's the Glenside Color Computer Club in the Chicago area. Those guys every year have a picnic where they get together and socialize, and I've never been. I assume they talk about the CoCo some, or who knows what they talk about at their picnic. They usually include some pictures of it in their newsletter. Anyway, so that was this past weekend. The guys they got together and did their thing, and so if you're on the Glenside email list, you can expect to get a newsletter before long, and I expect that it will likely contain some pictures from the picnic to make you all jealous that you weren't able to go to the Chicago area to socialize with the folks from Glenside. So
close in timing, I could have made it there. I was just at VCF a few weeks ago.
Oh yeah, it's a shame they didn't have that lined up a little easier for you, huh? Anyway, well, I think that actually concludes our news items. So once again, a lot of news for the CoCo this time. Every month we seem to have more news than you might expect for a 35-year-old platform. But it's good stuff.
It's a Radio Shack Merry Christmas.
This year, I needed to give a real family pleaser.
Honey, please help me with this budget.
How about a new game, Dad? Please.
And I found it. Radio Shack's Color Computer 2. On sale for just $99.95. It entertains, educates, manages. It's expandable and affordable. Now that really pleases me.
The Color Computer 2. Sale price for Christmas. Only at Radio Shack.
Okay, so this time we have some listener feedback. We actually have a little more than usual, or at least certainly more individuals giving us some feedback this time. I think we're going to go back and forth because, as I mentioned earlier, it seemed like some of you guys prefer to talk to just one or the other of us. So, well, I think we're going to share some stuff that we've discussed and had discussions we've had with people in the community. First up, we did get, I mentioned Brian Blake last time in relation to the CoCo, his involvement with the mechanical keyboard project, actually projects being discussed on the list last month. And so he writes in that to clarify, he is a proponent of a mechanical keyboard project, and I think he was favoring Ed Snyder's version of the proposal. which I don't think he's disparaging Mark Blair's version at all. Just that like you said, I think he was favoring Ed's version. Either way, I think he'd be happy to have a mechanical keyboard. I did sort of ask or mention that I wasn't sure about Brian's hardware involvement. So he did say, to answer your query about my ability, I remember enough about my apostrophe Tron, my Tron chasing days in the Navy to get me into trouble. Wink. I've done a few layouts of personal projects, but never built any of them, though I have rescued a couple non-working CoCo 3s from the grave. Well, I think we've all probably done that, or at least tried. So anyway, Brian, I certainly did not mean to disparage your abilities at all. And I think you probably took it in good stride. It's great to hear from you. Glad to know there's somebody out there listening to us. Haven't seen any more news on the mechanical keyboard front. Maybe we'll get an update, and if we hear more, we'll include that in the list or in a future podcast. So Neil, it sounds like you heard from Brett Gordon.
I did. I received an email from him a few weeks ago saying thank you for the Grand Prix game review. It's nice to hear that, Brett, and glad to hear that you got to experience that game that you didn't know about.
I know I've enjoyed another podcast hearing about games I was unaware of, and I assume that our listeners feel the same way. In fact, I had not heard of Grand Prix either, really, other than some discussions with you. So I assume it's a valuable service, and I certainly have enjoyed them. So it's good to hear some feedback from the community. See, someone else we heard from, I think both of us heard from Glenn Vandenbigler, who is the CoCo Lounge fellow. And let's see, I think the big quote here, he wanted to make a point that he gets these hauls, as he calls them, in full of retro computers from time to time. He said this a couple of weeks ago. He said he's planning to get another huge TRS-80 haul in, which I believe he got in this week. So I've been seeing him post some stuff again on his CoCo Lounge site. And I think the main point he was trying to make was that the CoCo Lounge never really goes away. Sometimes it kind of gets a little slow, but it'll always be back, I think, is the point he's trying to make.
It's always around. You never know what kind of goodies are going to show up on there either.
Yeah. So. Yeah, he has some good stuff in there. From time to time, some interesting stuff has shown up. And I know an EEPROM programmer showed up at Neil's house, and they showed up at my house.
EEPROM burner's getting around.
Yeah.
The other thing you mentioned, it's kind of neat about the CoCo Lounge. It's not anymore, but when the CoCo Lounge was first opened, I think it was back in 2004, 2005, Glenn used to put the Radio Shack catalog numbers for each product that Radio Shack sold. I just thought that was kind of neat. So, for example, like 26 dash, whatever the number was, that's what he had on the site.
Cool. Well, that's good with identifying stuff, and just in case there's any discrepancy or whatever. I know, just as a public service thing, or anybody listening that is selling CoCos on eBay, I think a lot of people will post their CoCo 2s, some of the other CoCos, but without any reference to the exact model. And there are some differences between the different CoCo 2 models, and some of us are interested in acquiring some of the models that we don't have, or maybe another one of something we do have. And it's kind of frustrating. A lot of times people will post them, and they'll post pictures of the top and the bottom and whatever else, or if they have a box, they'll show that. But it's surprising how many times people will post a CoCo for sale and not mention the model number.
The CoCo 2 had so many variations too.
There were a number of variations. There were at least 3 or 4, maybe more than that, actual numbers, and then some of those had A and B versions as well. So anyway, so it's kind of off to the side here. But if you are a CoCo, an eBay seller selling a CoCo 2 in particular, or any of the CoCos, you probably should put it in the model number, and it'll help us. You probably get some extra bidders because I know I've got enough CoCo 2s that I'm just not going to take a risk on bidding on a CoCo 2 that's not the model that I want. So anyway, back to our regularly scheduled programming here. I did get an email from Steve Bamford. I think we mentioned him as well on the podcast before. Steve did a version of Flappy Bird on the Dragon called Flaggin' Bird. It's a pretty good looking version of Flappy Bird. And if you're into playing a Flappy Bird style games, I definitely think you should check that out. Anyway, Steve, he's like I said, he's a Dragon guy, and there's some differences between how the Dragon DOS worked and how RS DOS worked, and he was having a little difficulty getting something done over there that he wanted to test, and so he just sent me a note asking about how some RS DOS commands worked, and I filled them in as best I could, and I think we made some progress. So there you go. If you're not sure who else to reach out to, and you don't really have any show feedback, but you might have a question or two, I think I'll go ahead and speak for Neil and think that he's probably open to some questions. I'm open to some questions, so feel free to reach out. Let's see. One more thing. We did get a feedback on the Facebook group from someone named Chris Jonesy. He said, you mentioned a CoCo YouTube retro tutorial in episode 0. Could you post a link? And then he came back and said, it's around 25 minutes in, and he says he found it. I'm not sure what he's talking about. So if you know what he's talking about, or if you're Chris, let me know what you mean, because I'm not really sure what the YouTube retro tutorial would be. I have not actually gone back and listened to all of episode 0, so it might be obvious, but I don't remember talking about that. So I'd like to just be reminded, what is he talking about? What did you mean? And so Chris, give me, I'd like to buy a vowel is basically what I'm saying. All right. Well, one more bit of listener feedback, and this one's Neil.
Yes. When I was at VCF Midwest, I got the chance to meet a guy named Walter Maraglia. I really hope I pronounce your last name right. If not, please let me know. And anyways, turns out he wasn't a CoCo user at all. He was a Commodore guy, and he just came to our booth we had running, and he saw the CoCos in action we had demoing, and that was it. He went gung-ho. He said he went CoCo nuts over the machine, and now he has a CoCo 1, 2, 3, and a FPGA. So he's got the whole arsenal there.
Wow, he went all in on the FPGA as well, huh?
He just sent me an email a couple days ago saying he splurged and he's got it up and running. And what's really neat is I had no idea, so I was talking to him. He's from Canada. He's from Toronto, just a couple hours away from me. And here we are. We're in Chicago at VCF. So you just never know. And
cool.
So he's enjoying our podcast. So I want to say thank you for listening.
Where is there a good place to get poutine in Chicago, I wonder?
That's a good question, although the pizza's very good.
The pizza's pretty good, yeah. That's funny. All right. Well, that's cool. I think that probably wraps up our listener feedback this time.
Now, if there is any dedicated group of old computer users, it is certainly the people who still love their CoCo, the Tandy color computer.
Okay, so we are going to have a kind of a new segment here. We're going to try this out where it's just a kind of a free-form discussion between Neil and I on a topic of interest. And we're going to start it off with a topic that I've seen come up kind of once in a while on the list over the past many years, and it's not always overt, but sometimes it's just sort of an undercurrent of discontent, shall we say? But it's on the notion of retro projects and whether or not people steal projects from each other, and by that I mean when somebody comes up with a project idea, and then somebody else says, hey, that's a cool project, and then they run off with it. Sometimes there's some hurt feelings, and sometimes it's not quite that simple. There definitely been projects on the list where people have done very similar things, sometimes in a way that kind of seem like direct competition. I'd say, well, I'm not trying to stir anything up here, but the history of the list would show that maybe this is the category where the drive wire versus CocoNet controversy came to a head a few years ago. But it's not always quite so such a conflict or whatever. But sometimes people, they have project ideas and they don't want to share them with a list because they're afraid that somebody else might take them and run with them or whatever. And I certainly have had that kind of experience where I'll mention a project idea sometimes and have it show up later, or often I'll have somebody show up with a project that they've saying that they're working on, and it turns out that's something that I've had in the back of my head for a while, and you get that kind of aw shucks kind of moment, and then I'm always like, well, I was going to work on that, and I don't really like how they're doing it. Maybe I should still do it anyway, and then anyway, I'm kind of rambling.
Well, one of the worst parts about it is if somebody's claiming to do a project, but they never come through with it, just to claim the glory, but then it never, nothing materializes from it.
Yeah, right. And that's sort of the flip side, right? You get people who claim that they're working on something, and then, like I said, nothing ever shows up. Months pass, sometimes nothing's said at all, or if somebody does ask about it, there's been no progress at all, and yet it still kind of hangs out there like, well, yeah, but I'm still doing it, so you should do something else. So I think
that's right.
And I think it's kind of, it's sort of an unclear, situation, ethically or whatever the term is. On the one hand, it's a small sort of, you'd think maybe we should be able to stay out of each other's way, and avoid projects that directly compete, and it makes sense not to waste a lot of time going head to head on projects that are essentially the same. But on the other hand, a lot of projects are out there that are not necessarily that original anyway. Well, so one that's been out there, I know there's a couple of one out there, so I'll just go ahead and cite it. There's the composite video adapters. That it's cool and they're nice and they're great, and I'm not disparaging anyone's work. In fact, I have a customer of a couple of people who've been making them. But realistically, the basic circuit at least is available in the data sheet for the 6847. And I know Ed Snyder has said that at least part of his circuit design was essentially copied from a somewhat different and nicer circuit, but still a circuit from a commercial source. I think it was actually from a Radio Shack converted composite CoCo. There's certainly the work done in laying out a board and manufacturing and all that sort of thing. And again, I'm not disparaging anyone's work on that. Well, I don't think Ed is upset that there's someone else out there who's been selling ones on eBay. I could be wrong. I'm speaking for Ed. Maybe I shouldn't. But someone else has them out available on eBay, and I don't think Ed's particularly upset about it. But, you could see where that's the kind of thing where somebody could be upset. And that's sort of where I'm going is, there's projects out there where people, kind of do, sort of the same project. And is that a problem? And so I've been rambling. I'm going to shut up and let you talk for a while, Neil.
Well, no, I was just gonna add in there, like with Ed, Ed's composite board. Basically, I found out about that one before the one that was on eBay. And I think that's a good thing that Ed is making them. I mean, I know it's kind of a copy of an old project from, years ago, but it gives a chance for people to actually get their hands on it, where there might not be many made or many left available, I should say, from the original run.
Well, right, and so that's another aspect, like for a hardware project. I mean, so far Ed's been doing a lot of stuff, and he's continuing to produce his various boards. I know he's continuing to produce the CoCo STC, and I'm certainly, again, I'm not trying to pick on Ed at all, but at some point Ed may find something else to do, and it might be nice at that point if someone else has a source of composite modifications for whoever doesn't have one at that point. Now you might argue, let's wait and see if that happens. A reasonable argument to make too. So I don't know. I don't know where people are on that. And it probably depends. It's just, maybe we could get off the hardware stuff. I mean, there's software projects that are like that too. I mean, what if two people decided that they were going to do, what if somebody else decided they wanted to do a Flappy Bird game? I don't know. I'm not trying to start any fights. Maybe I should not mention a specific, let's say Boulder Dash. Let's say somebody decided to do Boulder Dash, and then someone else decided, you know what, I'm going to do Boulder Dash. And so what if we had two competing versions of Boulder Dash out there, which would be fantastic from an enthusiast sort of standpoint. But you can see where the whoever was doing that might be whoever announced first or whoever was working on it first. You can see where one might be angry with the other. Would that be a big deal? Is that should you just shut up and get over it, or should we actively try to avoid that? I know there were some discussions I've seen of people and maybe in other groups saying, well, maybe everybody should announce what they're working on, and we'll have like a registry. And, if before you go to work on a new project, you go look in the registry and see if somebody's working, right?
I just think that if two people do the same project, it's kind of a waste of resource in a sense, it's because it's overlapping, say two of the same games of Boulder Dash. It might be nice to see Boulder Dash and say, a Bomberman game, for the CoCo 3. I'm just throwing that out there.
That's true. And you're right. It would be a shame to waste the resources. But, speaking of somebody who would write a game, if I want to write Bomberman, or if I want to write, Boulder Dash, I may not want to write Bomberman, and so telling me that, somebody else is already doing it, you go away. Yeah. You know what I mean?
True.
So that wouldn't seem very fair either. Yeah.
Like, for example, we have, a good 512K board right now from Cloud9. So it'd be kind of silly if somebody else was to make a 512K board, when there's already a perfectly one, being sold.
I think we may actually have seen that, but, so if somebody wants to make one, well, what if they only want to make, they want to make a run of 3 of them or something, right? It doesn't really affect the market. It's really just their exercise. Is that wrong? It's certainly not wrong in any moral sense.
No.
Is it ethically wrong? I don't think so, but I can see where it might irk Cloud9, for example, who's put a lot of resources into producing a very nice 512K board, then have to compete with somebody who might have, I don't know, a wire-wrapped 512K board or something. I mean, I don't know. Like I say, you see these discussions sometimes. I know I've been involved privately with discussions like this with some people in the community who produce things or whatever. And, it's certainly annoying. I know I could see where it'd be irritating for somebody to go off and produce something that's really similar or exactly the same. Oh, maybe it's a bigger issue for hardware. In the software case, you're less likely to see quite as much overlap, I think, and particularly if you're doing an original game.
That's true. And for the hardware, there's also the aspect of, if somebody's just making, say a 512K board, we'll use as an example again, they're just making it to learn it. That's one thing. They're not actually making it to sell it. Then that's, I think that would be all right if it's just your own project.
Yeah. Well, certainly if it's just for you, there should be no problem at all, right? You're certainly not obligated to buy a product that someone's produced. But then if you, like you say, you start to cross the line, or maybe there's more of an issue, say, just for the economy of scale, you make 5 of them, and you sell those off, well, then you're in competition a little bit. But I don't know, maybe that's maybe that's not big enough to be an issue. And I don't know, again, the software that you're doing, it kind of depends on exactly what you're trying to do, whether you're trying to, I don't know, I guess what we've come to is it's sort of a big, it's a bit of a philosophical thing, and maybe it just depends on the person, or maybe it just depends on the situation. Maybe there's just no real right answer here, but hopefully this isn't a terrible a segment that's a terrible waste of time. But I guess I just sort of wanted to maybe wrestle a bit with a question that we sometimes see in the community. And I guess I'll tell you where I'm at this point. So I've been in the CoCo community since back in the day, but as far as a collector or as part of a retro hobby, I've been doing this at least 20 years. And there's not very many projects related to the CoCo that pop up that I haven't at least thought of at one point or another that, hey, it'd be cool if I did that, or at least if somebody did that. And so I don't have a lot of respect for people claiming to own a project just on the basis of they thought of it, because I probably thought of it too. And I know, I know I've had thought overlap, shall we say, on a lot of projects that have shown up over the years, some that are kind of active today and some that have been active in the past. Like I said, if in cases where you built hardware, that's fine. I'm not real big on making a business out of the hobby anyway, so I'm probably not going to compete with you in that sense. But if I've thought of it, or if I want to do it, I'm probably going to go ahead and do the project. And I think that's probably where most people should be. That's why I'd be pretty leery of any kind of idea registry or whatever, because I get really tired of people who show up and claim that they're working on something and then they walk away and it never appears. Yeah, it's fine if it doesn't appear just because they found something else better to do. But if it does appear, but it comes from someone else, then I don't think they have much right to complain. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely.
So, well, there you have it. I've pronounced my opinion, and that's the way it should be. But no, seriously, people might have different opinions. I would love to hear what other people think. If you think I'm really missing something, or if you really think that people ought to be able to scope out their future projects and not have anybody touch them, I'd love to hear your reasoning on that. And if you think there is a bright line for, what kind of projects that if somebody else has done them, you shouldn't touch them. If you think there's a bright line there, I'd like to hear what you think that is. So give us, again, feedback at cococrew.org, or, reach us on Facebook, or send me a tweet. Any of that will work.
We'd definitely like to hear from you. I think really at the end of the day, what we really want to see is just more projects for the CoCo, because the community is still kind of small compared to other platforms.
Yeah, so the risk of prolonging the discussion, I have heard that listed, that because we're small, we shouldn't compete with each other. And I think that makes some sense. But on the other hand, because we're small, we don't have a lot of people to make projects or make new stuff. And I really don't want to discourage somebody from participating, because, maybe their first project is maybe that 512K board or that composite video board or whatever. Maybe that's your first project, and then maybe the next project is writing a new IP stack for the CoCo or something like that, right? And if you don't do the first project, maybe you don't get to the second project. So I'd rather see a little duplication if that's what turns up, as long as it keeps people active in the community. I think that's probably worthwhile.
This is true. If it keeps people motivated, that's perfect.
Cool. Well, Neil gets the last word. After these messages,
we'll be right back.
All right. Welcome back. This is John Linville with our fourth part of our series on CoCo architecture. This time we will be talking about the Motorola 6821 Peripheral Interface Adapter, also known as the PIA. The PIA is essentially just a what we would call today a general purpose I/O chip. And it just gives the CoCo a way to interface with other circuits. Kind of follow the similar format to the other chips. We'll talk about the history. Unfortunately, I don't really know much about the history of the PIA. It seems to go way back. The origins of the PIA are, of course, the same Motorola 6800 group. That was the birthplace of the 6809 and the 6847 and the 6883. So you can see that Motorola was basically a one-stop shop for Tandy, at least in terms of providing all of the major components of the CoCo chipset. The PIA was apparently pretty old. I see in the Wikipedia article about it, there's a reference that in 1976, Motorola switched the MC6800 family to a depletion mode technology, blah, blah, blah. You don't really need to understand what that means, except that it implies that the design had already been around significantly before 1976. So that was, of course, the original MC6820. The versions of the PIA in the CoCo are the 6821, and in some cases in the later CoCos, the 6822. They're all basically the same. Anyway, we'll just have to pretend that the history of the PIA is shrouded in the mysteries of the past. For what it's worth, there was a nearly identical chip available from MOS Technologies. That's the people who produced the 6502. If you know your ancient computer history, you know that the MOS group had been in the 6800 Design Center and had forked off under Chuck Peddle to do their own thing. And so I guess as part of that, they started producing their own version of the PIA as well. So anyway, so you'll see references to the 6520, maybe the 6521. Anyway, those are the MOS versions of the PIAs. They're pretty much the same. MOS also had a chip called the 6522, which is called the VIA, or Versatile Interface Adapter. It's similar in some ways. It does include a timer, and anyway, it's also a common chip. You'll run into it a lot. I'm in love with the CoCo. So the PIA was widely used in a variety of designs. Of course, it was used in the Tandy color computer and the Dragon 32 and 64. Realistically, the PIA finds its way into any number of designs involving, certainly involving the 6800 or 6809 processors. Quite often you find them involved with the 6502 designs. I think there was one used in the Apple I for scanning the keyboard. You see them in a lot of arcade machines and just any number of pieces of hardware designed at that time. It's a really versatile chip, and it's useful, pretty simple to interface with, particularly if you're using a 6800 or 6809 style of bus, or including the 6502. So you see them all over the place. It's not really practical or even really useful to list the number of or the known designs that use it, because there's just way too many. Anyway, so let's talk about the features of the chip. Each PIA includes two bidirectional 8-bit ports. Each of those ports has a matching what's called a data direction register. So basically you have a register where you set bits on and off, corresponding to whether the port is an output or that particular bit of the port is for output or input. So you can, set each bit independently. It's kind of cool. There are also two control registers. Those registers are involved in specifying some of the behaviors of the lines that can generate interrupts, which we'll get to in a second. And they also control whether you access the data register or the data direction register when you go to the base address for the chip. or for that port. Anyway, so not surprising, there's a control register, and there are actually 4 input lines that can generate interrupts on the chip, and 2 of those can be used they can be used as outputs as well, in which case, of course, they don't generate interrupts. But so anyway, you can do lots of neat things with all those bits now at your control and for both input and output purposes.
Hi, I'm Kevin Savitz of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. You're listening to the CoCo Crew. When you're ready to play with a real computer, play with an Atari.
So there's really not a lot to say about the PIAs. They're, as I said earlier, they're basically just general purpose I/O devices. And so the real question is, how does the CoCo make use of them? So the CoCo has 2 PIAs. One of them is addressed at hex FF00. That puts it in the slow clocking range for the SAM's address-dependent clocking mode. That PIA0 is used for scanning the keyboard, so it uses one port to select which row of the keyboard is being scanned, and uses its other port to detect which column of the keyboard might have a key press. It also uses a couple of its input lines there when not being used to scan the keyboard. They can be used to detect joystick presses. On the CoCo 3, it uses 2 more lines to do that for the second set of joystick buttons. Let's see, there's another line that's used for input from the comparator that's used for reading the joystick. So on the CoCo, when you want to read the joysticks, you use there's a DAC output, which we'll get to in just a second. But basically, you set up the digital to analog converter to output a certain voltage, and that gets fed into one side of a comparator. And then use an analog switch to choose which joystick access you want to test, and that value gets put into the other side of the comparator, and so then the comparator output is either 0 or 1. That output gets fed back into one of the pins on PIA 0, so that joystick comparator input is on PIA 0. Let's see, I just mentioned that there's a analog switch that's used. It's actually a 2-channel analog switch, and it's used for one thing to choose which joystick access is fed into the joystick comparator, just as we mentioned earlier. It's also used for selecting which audio source is fed to the RF modulator. So, all right, so that's a 4-way input on the switch, and so it needs 2 digital bits for selecting which of those 4 ways. And so it uses the 2 leftover or extra signals that are not part of the 2 8-bit ports. The ones that are usable as outputs, those come from PIA 0, and they're routed to choose that 2-channel analog switch. Unfortunately, both channels get switched to the same place, so it kind of complicates things if you want to, for example, put audio out and read the joystick at the same time. So that's an often cursed feature of the CoCo by the people who are trying to write games for it. Anyway, it is what it is. That's how it works. So that leaves 2 more signals on the PIA 0. Those are the interrupt generating signals. On PIA 0, these are tied to the horizontal sync and vertical sync from the VDG. Let's see. So the interrupt output from PIA 0 is tied to the actual IRQ line on the 6809. So that's the slower interrupt line. It's a bit unfortunate. That is fine for when you're using the vertical sync. For generating interrupts, but it's not too good when you're using horizontal sync, because those come in so fast that by the time you process the full-blown IRQ on the 6809, there's just not a lot of time left over to do anything else. So that's another somewhat unfortunate aspect of the color computer design. Anyway, moving on. So there's PIA1 is the other chip we're going to talk about that's used in implementing these peripherals.
Well, good afternoon. And my name's Tony Pedraza, and I am the host of the annual last Chicago CoCo Fest. We call it the last in quotes because we really don't know if we're going to have another one. And we haven't known every year for the past 17 years.
Okay, sorry for the interruption. Now we're going to talk about PIA1. Okay, so there's PIA1 is, of course, the other PIA on board in the CoCo. This one is addressed at hex FF20. That, of course, puts it in the fast clocking region for the address-dependent clocking mode of the SAM. That's kind of handy, I guess, because PIA1's first job we're going to talk about is that it is in control of the mode control bits going to the 6847. And so if you want to manipulate those bits sort of on the fly to get some extra effects, as is done in Dragonfire, or as I actually did in Sluzzle, or my VDG Tricks blog, you can at least do that at the higher clock speed, if you're running out of ROM. So I guess it actually doesn't apply for Sluzzle, but it did apply for Dragonfire, so that's cool. Let's see. The other big job of this PIA1 is, of course, is the output to the DAC, which I briefly mentioned earlier. So we have a 6-bit digital to analog converter that's connected off of one of the ports of PIA1. It's just implemented, at least in the original design, it's just implemented with a set of registers. So pretty cheap way to implement. It's effective, maybe not as precise as we would like. I think in the CoCo 2 and beyond, they ended up putting this into the ASICs on board, the custom ASICs for the CoCo. So maybe those are more precise. I'm not sure. But anyway, the DAC output, of course, is used for audio tone generation. It can also be fed as output to the cassettes for storing data on cassette. So, I mean, that's pretty much it. That's what it's used for. Let's see. So a couple of other pins on the PIA1 are used for implementing the bit banger serial port, RS-232 serial port. There's also a bit that's used for reading the data in from the cassette, which is there's a circuit that is used for detecting zero crossings on the waveform coming in from the cassette. The output from that is a single bit that gets fed to this PIA. When we come back to the extra bits on PIA1, one of them is used for turning on the cassette motor relay. This is used for the remote pin on your cassette drive, and so you can turn that on and off. And another bit is being used for enabling or disabling sound output, and that comes from either the DAC sources or from the cassette, or actually there's a sound input that can come through the cartridge port, and so that sound enable bit can turn those on or off completely. And then there's, I forgot to mention that one of the bits in one of the 8-bit ports is actually routed to where it can produce a 1-bit audio output, and so that's sort of kind of a beeper style output that's similar to what the Apple II audio is like. Let's see, the last two interrupt generating bits in this case, one comes from the CD line on the serial port, so theoretically when you get a carrier detect, it can generate an IRQ signal. In this case, this PIA's line is tied to the fast IRQ line on the 6809. So anyway, so that serial, the carrier detect pin on the serial port can generate a fast IRQ. to the 6809. The other interrupt generating input comes from the cart signal, so the cartridge port can also generate a fast IRQ signal. So that could be handy, for example, if you want to do put some kind of maybe a timer on maybe you could put a timer on a cart that runs at the speed that you want for audio playback, and you could do that. I don't think anyone's actually done that. I had intended to experiment with that in this year's Retro Challenge, but I kind of got sidetracked. I think that mostly covers how the PIAs are being used, except that there is a RAM size detection mechanism that's used to read some strapping that's done on the CoCo 1 motherboard. And strapping, by that I mean that, literally they would put down jumper wires on the motherboard to indicate the size of the RAM that's been installed. And seems to be a mechanism between the two PIAs. You can read out those bits so that you can then set up the SAM appropriately for what kind of RAM chips you have. But in general, you're not going to use those because all that stuff's going to be done by the CoCo's ROM as it's booting up BASIC, and you're just not going to need to mess with it. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Anyway, I think that's pretty much all there really is to say. Barring whatever tiny thing I've missed here and there, I'm sure somebody will let me know about that. But there's not a lot else to say about the PIA and the way they're used in the CoCo. Like I said, they're just the generic I/O ports are being put to good use, implementing, they're controlling the VDG, and they're implementing the DAC for audio output, including the cassette, and then the extra pins are being used for controlling the dual channel analog switch that routes audio output and is used for controlling which joystick is being input. And then there's a few other bits used here and there, as needed. So I think that pretty much covers it. I hope you've enjoyed this little foray into the internals of the CoCo. So, thanks.
Get ready, player 1. Get ready, player 2.
All right. For this episode of the Games Corner, I'll be reviewing one of my favorite pieces of hardware from back in the day, along with two games that go with it. That hardware is called the Dicom Light Gun Interface Adapter. This interface was made in 1987 from a software company in Canada called Dicom. The interface allowed you to attach a Sega Light Gun phaser, the original one from the Sega Master System, model 3050, to your Color Computer 3. This interface plugs into the right joystick port and serial port on the CoCo. The interface box requires a 9-volt battery as its power source. They also produced two games in order to take advantage of the gun, Iron Forest and Medieval Madness. There was also supposed to be a third game released based on a Wild West theme. Unfortunately, that never got completed before Dicom left the CoCo market. I never owned this interface in games back then, but I do remember borrowing it from the local Color Computer users group I belonged to several times. Like all light gun games from that era, it requires a CRT display to work. This will not work on modern LCD panels. However, it's still not hard finding a CRT monitor or television that has composite, or is that composite? I never know exactly how to pronounce that word. Composite? Composite? Anyways, it's not hard finding a CRT television that has a composite in port. Now on to the two games that support this interface. Like all games that Dicom produced, these two are top-notch. The first one they made was called Iron Forest. It is actually my favorite out of the two. In this game, the object is to protect a bird in the forest from all the other creatures and objects that show up, and to not shoot the bird yourself. To make things more difficult, if a monster or object goes behind a pillar on the screen, it will actually be behind the bird and not kill it. This game is massive, with 10 different scenes to go to, and each level has 15 screens made up of these scenes. And with each level, the creatures and objects get faster. Oh, and you also cannot rapid fire. There's a slight delay in reloading your gun. The other cool thing about this game is that it has digitized speech and sound. I'm a sucker for low sampling, grainy sounding speech. On the boot up title page you can hear, "Welcome to the Iron Forest." Here, let me play it for you.
Welcome to the Iron Forest.
Oh, and guess what? All of this goodness and excitement runs on a stock CoCo 3 with 128K of RAM. The second game they made is called Medieval Madness, and the object of this game was to protect your knight as he progressed through the countryside trying to rescue the princess. In the game, you are firing arrows, and the higher skill levels tried to simulate this somewhat by having a delay between you pressing the trigger and when the arrow would actually show up on the screen. Just like in Iron Forest, monsters could miss your knight if they are behind an object. This game featured even more digitized sound samples than Iron Forest did. This game is definitely more challenging out of the two. Again, it only requires a stock 128K CoCo 3 to run. Amazing how they pulled off these high caliber games in such a small amount of memory. As you are probably aware, these interface boxes are not the easiest to find. There was, however, back in 2010, a guy named Christian, sorry I can't remember his last name, from Quebec that made a reproduction of this adapter and sold them. I'm not exactly sure how many he made in total. There is also an excellent resource on Tim Lidner's website showing the internals and schematic along with a pile of information on this interface. I will make sure to add the website address on the show notes for this information. This would make a great project for someone to remake these adapters and then, perhaps, maybe even program a new game to take advantage of it. Well, CoCo Fest is only 7 months away. I hope you enjoyed this month's game review, and hopefully I sparked a new project idea for a few of you.
This episode of the CoCo Crew Podcast is brought to you by the numbers 6, 8, 0, and 9, and the letter E.
Well, it's that time again. We have reached the end of episode 4. We hope you enjoyed the podcast. I'd like to thank my host John Linville for yet again another incredible tech segment on the CoCo PIAs. I also would like to thank each and every one of you who listen every month. We appreciate your feedback and support. Until next month, happy CoCoing and CoCo forever.